Salutations, family, and peace to everybody out there in YouTube land. My name is Storm Hall, and I'd like to welcome you all back to Inside the Eye of the Storm. On this episode, we will be taking a deep dive into the history of government-subsidized housing, aka the projects, and their relation to a controversial government-funded science experiment that spanned well over 2 decades. After you're presented with the information contained within this video, you will be left asking yourself, did the United States government construct high-rise project buildings with the noble intentions of providing adequate housing to its less fortunate citizens? Or were the projects constructed with a far more sinister motive of population control and the ultimate genocide of people of color? Currently, an estimated 2 million United States citizens reside in government-subsidized housing, provided by 3,400 public housing authorities nationwide. The Great Depression marked what is the beginning of the United States government's direct funding of public housing. In a book written by Mr. Lawrence J. Vail entitled From Puritans to the Projects, Mr. Vail illustrates how most of the discourse on public housing is part of a larger issue on what constitutes societal responsibility. Namely, when should society help those in need of public housing, and what form should that assistance take? In his book, Mr. Vail goes on to elaborate that providing housing for people with financial constraints and those unable to take care of themselves independently has taken on a variety of shapes throughout history, which includes model tenements, settlement homes, almshouses, bridewells, and houses of industry. There was also the Homestead Act of 1862 that provided incentives in the form of land grants to Caucasians who would settle in the western frontier on the lands that were stolen by the United States government from the original Aboriginal indigenous peoples of this land. The flashpoint that brought the country's housing problem into the collective consciousness of mainstream America is when in 1890, a Danish immigrant, Mr. Jacob Riis, used the new technology of the day, flash photography, to document the tenement and lodging houses of New York City's most notorious slums in a book he entitled How the Other Half Live. In 1943, the United States Federal Housing Administration was created by an act of Congress. This new government entity made it easier for Caucasians to secure housing loans while redlining African American communities, which strongly enforced segregation and lowered property values in black communities. Contrary to popular belief, public housing was not created to assist the country's poorest families, but instead was created to assist white middle-class families that were struggling to recover from the Great Depression. The Housing Act of 1937 created public housing on the outskirts of major urban centers and used the general approach of constructing low-rise dwellings. This approach to housing middle-class families lasted until the end of World War II. Housing in general changed dramatically after World War II. White servicemen returning from the war utilized the GI Bill that was signed into public law on June 22, 1944 by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to move their families away from the inner city to the suburbs in droves in what is now known as white flight. White families' ability to purchase these homes, an asset that increased in value, firmly cemented these families into the middle class, creating the wealth ownership disparity that is present till this very day amongst black and white Americans. Black servicemen, on the other hand, faced extreme racism in the forms of redlining and racial covenants that prevented them from purchasing prime real estate. President Harry Truman signed the Housing Act of 1949 into effect, allocating large amounts of federal funding for what is now called urban renewal. The brilliant African-American writer James Baldwin recoined the phrase Negro removal. The federal government, under this act, built high-rise housing projects nationwide to house black and brown city dwellers. This is in stark contrast to the low-rise public housing they provided for white middle-class families in the Housing Act of 1937. In sight of all the racial disparities that I have presented, it is apparent that the United States government's approach to housing citizens of different ethnicities varies dramatically. But it wasn't until I researched a group of scientific experiments conducted by Mr. John B. Calhoun that I unearthed a startling revelation. In 1947, an expert on animal behavior and population control, Mr. John B. Calhoun conducted one in a long line of scientific experiments where he constructed what was considered a utopian society for rats. The structure was purpose-built to satisfy the rats' every need. But despite furnishing the rodents with everything to sustain a thriving colony, within 2 years, the entire population of rats were dead. The initial enclosure was constructed with vertical tunnels that the scientists called stairwells. 4 horizontal corridors opened off each one of these stairwells, leading to 4 nesting boxes. There were 256 boxes in total. So in essence, the enclosure was a replica of a high-rise project building. In the 25th incarnation in his line of experimentation, Mr. Calhoun constructed an enclosure that could have easily supported 5,000 rats. But the rodent population never exceeded 200, despite having unlimited food, water, and the absence of any external predator or threat. Mr. Calhoun observed, even though provided with ample space, the rats would congregate in small areas, causing a breakdown in social structure that led him to coin the phrase behavioral sink. Mr. Calhoun theorized that this would be the inevitable result of any overpopulated society of animals on the planet. In the early 1960s, Mr. Calhoun's research attracted the attention of the National Institute of Mental Health, who were extremely intrigued by the observed effects of overpopulation on rodents, and specifically, could any of his findings be applied to humans. To these ends, the NIMH funded Mr. Calhoun's research and provided him with land in Maryland to continue his research. During these experiments, the most notable observations were the stop in population growth and an abrupt breakdown in the social behavior between both males and females. The male rats of the colony, without needing to protect a territorial food source, became dejected and began forming cliques or gangs that randomly perpetuated violence against one another for seemingly no reason. The female rats, in turn, stopped caring for their young and displayed heightened levels of aggression towards their offspring, in some cases committing infanticide. The male rats of the colony, estranged from most of the females, continued to perform sexual acts with any rats in the general vicinity, male or female, which led to a proliferation of homosexuality. This slowly but surely led to the male and females no longer breeding. This in turn dramatically dropped the population of the rats in the experiment. But even after rescinding to population levels where the rats had previously flourished, the rats refused to return to breeding or to resume their natural social interactions. The last birth in the experiment occurred on day 600. Thereafter, the population slowly dwindled and completely died out. When presented with all of the information, it is impossible not to observe the correlation between the government-funded scientific research of Mr. John B. Calhoun and the government's construction of high-rise project buildings nationwide. The behaviors that Mr. Calhoun observed during his research, ranging from unsolicited acts of violence, the formation of gangs, poor parental performance, an increase in homosexuality, and the abandonment of traditional social behaviors are reflected daily. After being presented with all the information, the hard dilemma that we're left to ponder is what began as the United States government providing affordable housing to struggling white middle-class families at the end of the Great Depression. Has it morphed into a proving ground for genocide of people of color? As a young man, I always remember people using the crab in a barrel analogy to describe the behavior of black people. But through my studies, I've learned that in their natural environment, crabs uplift and support one another. It's only when crabs are removed from their natural environment and placed in a hostile environment that they display the unnatural behavior of harming and pulling down one another. I hope that you'll ponder everything I presented to you. This is very profound information. I hope to see you on my next episode of Inside the Eye of the Storm. Like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And I'll see you on my next episode. Peace, family.